that was my introduction for you, but I would love for you to introduce yourself in your own words and just share anything you feel called about your work and how you came to your business. Is this working, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're on a journey together.
Okay. Hello, people. My name is Bayo, and the first time I entered here, I said to Jake that this feels like a revolution of some kind. Like, this is exactly what you would want if you were starting some underground movement, right? Like an underground political assemblage of some kind, yeah. Which is apt for this year, isn't it? Like, right? You don't need to be polite. I'm not. Oh, it's good to be here. And someone asked me a while ago, where am I from? Which is a difficult question to answer these days. I'm from Nigeria originally. I'm Yoruba. You might know some Yoruba people. But I live in India. I haven't lived in Nigeria for a long time. I live in India with my family, so I cook great dosas, the best dosas. But for a while, I'm going to be in Massachusetts here, in Great Barrington. I'm visiting professor at Clark University, and the this is long, so I'm just going to take a deep breath. It's the W.E.B. Du Bois Scholar in Residence for Transpublic Intellectualism. Okay. And that's at the Schumacher Center for New Economics. And so my family is running around with beers and deer and geese, and we're having a good time. It's good to be here. Thank you for having me. Maybe some other aspects of my work and my thought would emerge in conversation, but I'm grateful to be here. Thank you.
So, binary or attention that we often talk about and explore at Atmos is the duality between science and spirituality that has really been authored in the Western world, and it has taught us to understand science really through the lens entirely of objectivity. And objectivity is a practice of making something impersonal, right? Of removing the self from it in a certain way. And so I'm always interested in this question of how can we look at or how can we understand science and spirituality as not opposites, but two sides of the same coin, right? Science is the study of life. Spirituality, in some ways, is the study of the sacred. At what point in time did we stop seeing life as sacred? At what point in time did we stop seeing these two things as connected? And this is something you and I spoke about briefly, and I'm curious how that shows up for you in your own work, in your own line of thinking, and particularly something you shared to me once around spirituality rendering science as poetry. I'm wondering if you can touch a little bit on that. You said that. I mean, listen, I wish I could take credit for it, but it was definitely you.
Okay, so here's the beautiful, here's another thing about me. I'm a nerd. Yay? Nerds unite separately, you know. I say that because when I was an undergrad, billions of years ago, I didn't go to class that often because it was boring to me. I decided to write a book because I was just on my own. I took the words of Mark Twain seriously. Never let your schooling get in the way of your education. Only nerds. She said that with me. And so I would go to the library. I was a triangular student. Library, class, bedroom. Right. I didn't have a social life. In that time, I wrote a book called Moses or Darwin. Moses or Darwin. And no one asked me to do this, but I just wrote a 200-page book as a sophomore. exploring reason and faith. And so it's been very dear to me, this conversation. And maybe one way to popularize this is to invite us to notice there's a conflict, a civilizational conflict, that tries to premise itself on the cosmological, philosophical split between rationality and faith. Never the twain shall meet is the proposal, that to be rational is to be faithless, or to be faithful is to be irrational. There's the law of the Socratic excluded middle here. They never jive with each other. But I want to tell you a story, if you'd allow me. A brief story that disrupts that idea a little bit. And this just came to me, this story. Just so I'm not prepared. I never prepare for anything, just so you know. I think this happened. Anyone here heard of Edmund Haley? Sir Edmund Haley. Everyone obviously has heard of Edmund Haley. Brother there, sir. Haley's Comet? So Edmund Haley had an idea, and it was a radical idea. It was criminal. He said that in the year 1758, a comet would appear. Now, that might seem trite, might seem boring to us now, but I want us to understand, in those days when he said those words, they were very, 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 very fugitive, radical things to say, because no one thought about comets as things that were predictable, right? This was a time in the UK when the Anglican Church, the Church of England, had rules about how to engage publicly. And this all had to be engaged or premised on scriptural integrity. The Bible declares that God made the world. And if God made the world, those things dashing through the sky are not predictable things. They're angels on a mission. The angels going to deliver a message from one end of the planet to another end of the planet. Those were the popular ways people thought about comets, as messengers. So when Edmund Haley, in his conversations with Newton, said, I think the comet we saw in 1607 and 1531 and 1607 and 1682 are the same comet. And I think it'll come back in 1758. Everyone's minds, because it was an impossible thing to say. And the Anglican Church took opposition to this. They said, we will oppose you to the ends of the earth because God made the earth and blah, 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 blah. So when in 1758 that comet came, it broke everything people thought about God and spirituality, because it was a civilizational war, reason versus faith. And reason kind of won out, right, temporarily. And so everyone didn't know how to think about this. But how could a man, a single, irascible, jocular, unserious fellow, predict the motions of the planet or of the cosmos? So this war has been going on for a long time. I don't think it's a war after all. I don't think it's a war. I don't think it's reason versus faith any more than I think it's Iron Man versus Wakanda. It's nothing of the sort. Did that go over your heads? I'm dropping jewels here for the nerds among you, and I'm not getting any response. So here's my thought. I don't think it's reason versus faith after all. I think, in my opinion, it was just a mild commotion in the hallways of human exceptionalism, right? Most of the ways we think about the world is premised on human separation, right? That we're separate and separable from ecologies, from the planet. That we are unique, we're exceptional, and that we're all by ourselves. So when we think about reason, we think about it starting here. And I'm a psychologist, a recovering psychologist. So most of the time we think it starts here. The rationality begins here. The cognition begins here. So whether it's reason or faith, we're dealing with the same problem of human separability, right? I'm here to suggest, along with my sister here, that I don't think reason has ever been at odds with faith. In fact, I think science is a kind of faith. Science has its own priesthood, right? It has its own rituals. It has its own ways of predicting and managing and controlling the world. Science is incredibly tethered to colonial projects. I don't need to speak about Tuskegee, the experiments in Alabama, or the ways that we conduct science around the world, which is already political. It's a political project. It's never neutral. Science has never been neutral or acultural, apolitical, or ahistorical. It has always been territorial. And it has always managed itself by excluding other ways of being in the world. It is not a superior epistemology, is what I'm trying to say. Okay. Maybe I'll just end this response by saying that I often think that a more generative way of thinking about this diversity of thought is to think about representationalism versus performativism. I'll explain what that means. Representationalism is what my sister Willow was just speaking about a while ago, that we can stand apart from the world and represent it. And it's the integrity of our representation that matters. Who sees clearly? Clarity becomes a political vocation of representing the world as it really is, right? This is what science is trying to do. Science is not bad. We need science. We need toilets. We need, mobile phones and all of that. But I'm trying to say here that we make a mistake when we think that we stand apart from the world. So performativism says we're not apart from the world. We are imbricated with what the world is doing. Right? So it's not a metaphysics of dots, it's a metaphysics of lines. And we're always connected with how lines converge and disperse. So, in other words, people, we are in a time when science is meeting its excluded other, when it is coming to a sense of humility about what it can know, right? Who's watched the movie Contact? Jodie Foster. Yeah, everyone has done that. There's a scene, and I'll just end with this. There's a scene in that movie where we just started to live in the United States, but I hear that there's a ritual and there's a sacred rite of not spoiling movies. But I'm Nigerian, and I don't adhere to Nigerian princes are crafty fellows. So, in the tail end of the movie, after Jodie Foster's character builds this multi-dimensional spacefaring machine and travels to another dimension altogether, she leans outside of the window and sees something that the director wisely does not show the audience. She leans outside, and her face is enraptured with the beauty of what she sees. And she says, they should have sent a poet. And I think this applies to our times, that there are moments when the ways we territorialize the world, because knowing is moralizing work, it's civilizing work. Knowing is not something that happens here. Knowing is how we move, how we make love, how we think, how we eat, how we defecate. All of that is knowing, right? But that leaning out and noticing the boundaries of knowledge is where we are as a planet today. We're noticing the edges of what we thought we knew. And we're coming to that precipice where we're being invited to take on a new kind of faith, which is what I call falling. Okay.
First of all, I just want to say, did not have that story or answer prepared, but offhand knew all of the dates of Halley's Comet coming to Earth, passing by Earth. So, round of applause for that, I think. Great. I love what you shared also around science having its own form of priesthood. Yeah. I think it's interesting. Science and the church, we'll use, rather than speaking to religion as a whole, I'm just going to stick with the metaphor or the entity of the church. And I think as much as there has historically been opposition, as in the story that you shared, there's also some ways in which they function similarly in terms of how how we police knowledge and how we police understanding of the world around us. And that's why I think it's really important that when we talk about science, we're very also specific in what we're talking about here, right? I mean, some of you might be in this room right now being like, do they hate science? Is this not a climate weekend? We love science, to be clear, but it's also important to again, locate, and I love what you shared around science being territorial. Yes. Because there are forms of science, there are indigenous forms of science that have always included spirituality. There are so many realms and worlds of science that are outside of Western understandings of science. And many of those have been forcibly erased. And, you know, I'm just something that's coming up for me right now is just a history of women who have practiced understanding or being in tune with the natural world and being persecuted as witches. Do we have any witches in the audience? Please, thank you. You can ask for the nerds, I'll speak to the witches. But I bring that up as an example because the root of the word witch is wit. It literally just means wise. And we have this entire story in history and monstrosity around like what this word means. And it literally just means a person who is wise, a wise woman specifically. That's all I have to say about witches, but I have a feeling they'll come up again. Something, you actually, speaking of monstrosity, I wanted to talk about this because it's a word that you come back to and you circle around quite a bit, and particularly the promise of the monstrous and the archetype of the trickster. And I'm curious if you can share a little bit about what monstrosity means to you and why that word holds so much.
There's a Yoruba story about a trickster whose name is Eshu. Anyone knows Eshu? You heard? Oh, okay. I love telling the story. It's a beautiful recalibration of the accounts of the transatlantic slave theft. Okay, I often practice not calling it a trade. So, in this story told by a Nigerian professor, I think he's still alive in the United States now, a Yoruba professor, Femi Yuba, it's dramatized often, theatrical productions. When the ships came to the Bight of Benin and they came and started gathering black bodies, or they started gathering bodies into blackness rather than, the Orishas, which are the avengers of the Yoruba cosmological system. I'm throwing out my I'm throwing to you my Americanisms to assure you that I'm here.
This talk is not sponsored by Marvel, just so everyone is.
Like I've started hiking now, and I tell people on the hiking trail that it's worth it. So I'm in. I'm in is what I'm in. I'm trying to tell you that I'm in. And I want to be celebrated that I've arrived here for a moment. I'm kidding. Where was I? I often digress. Okay, yes, so monsters and issues. So the Orishas, they're superhuman. They hold the powers to the agency around thunder and lightning and everything you can think about of how the earth works. And so this particular Orisha, Ogun, who is the god of metal and iron and victory especially. So you know this dude had everything he needed to win this battle, right? He decided to mount up an insurgency to push back against the slavers, to push them away. And so he gathered his men together and chased them, went to the shores to chase them away. But along the way, he was interrupted by his brother, Eshu. Eshu is very popular, especially in Brazil. I think he's more popular in Brazil than in Nigeria at the moment, which speaks about diasporic complexities. But I digress again. Eshu. interrupts his brother and says, you know what, I think we should go in the morning, not now, in the night. I think it's strategically wise to do so in the morning. Why don't we rest for now, take a break, and see what happens? And as his brother, Ogun, decides to follow his instructions, Eshu gives him a very, very intoxicating cup of palm wine. I'm not going to tell you what that is, but don't find out, okay? And Ogun takes palm wine and is knocked out completely. Don't ask me how his entire army is knocked out as well, but everyone is knocked out, and Eshu proceeds to sneak aboard those ships and travels with the slaves across the Atlantic. And that's it. That's the story. I've stayed with that story for many years, not knowing what to do with it. Because there was a time in my life I wanted to pull down the powers that be, right? My fist was perpetually raised. I wanted to pull down, I read Walter Rodney on how Europe underdeveloped Africa. I wanted to address the colonial tensions of my time by fighting the powers that be. And then I hear this story, and it interrupts and disrupts my cartographical project of decoloniality. And it teaches me about the monstrous, right? Now here's what I think about the monstrous, and why I think Eshu did what he did, and why we need a trickster today, especially in times of climate chaos and collapse. Karl Marx had a statement that the senses have a history. Does anyone know that? Okay. The senses have a history. We don't just have senses. How many senses do we have, people? Do you know? 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Well, here's an idea. We don't have senses. We don't have senses. Senses have us. It's a slight nuanced twist on the popular idea that we have senses. We have anything is a very capitalist notion, right? It's like it's our property. It's a biological substrate. It's already there. But that is inadequate to speak about the ways that our senses are political projects. For instance, in the 1800s, what was considered flagrant, is not what is considered flagrant now, right? Senses are attached to politics and economics and movements. So we don't have senses. Sensation enlists bodies in how it comes to matter. Right? So I believe that we live in a sensorium. This is a communal project of kinship and belonging. We live in a sensorium that teaches and entrains our bodies how to think, how to smell, how to see, how to notice the world. It also excludes other possibilities. Let me give a very, very activated, grounded example of how this works that might come across as ungentlemanly, but I don't care about those polite ethics because I'm not a gentleman. So everyone here farts. I think we do that. It's philosophical work, it's spiritual work, it's economic work, it's rest. We fart. Farting is good, farting is life.
I was so not prepared for this turn. And
Have you, I was going to say, have you ever farted? Have you ever entered a room and maybe someone farts and then it stinks up the place? Maybe you're in a plane or something, but better, the metaphor works when you're in a room because someone enters. But over some time, you don't smell it anymore, right? You're in the stink of it, but you don't smell it anymore. And then someone enters the room and what's this, right? It's a process that psychologists rudely call desensitization, right? You've become desensitized to the smell. You've become part of the odorous furniture of the space. You're now the space. You're not in the space. You're now just like we're not in traffic, we are traffic, right? So in a sense, we become part of sensorial fields. And desensitization is a way that the sensorium breaks out of its own self, right? This is how the monster comes in. most of the time we think about monsters as violent entities. I think monsters introduce us to the to the violence of the normative. They don't come with violence. They say violence is already here, right? They are desensitizing forces, right? Does that make sense, right? The monstrous is the interruption of the normal, right? We've always, in folklore, used the monster as an edge kind of entity. You know, in Yoruba stories, in African folklore, the place where you're not supposed to go is to the edge of the city or the edge of the village. All parents say, don't go there, right? But there are times when we need to go to the edge because we're stuck in the middle, you see. Does anyone know about a death spiral? Jake knows I speak about this all the time. You know, Willow knows. You don't know? A death spiral is when ants are in a pheromonic accident of some kind. They secrete these chemicals that guide themselves to their home. And they go around in circles because this accident happens and they cannot find their way home. So they just keep on going round and round. Sometimes ant death spirals have been observed to last for days. They just walk in circles for days. There are motivational speakers among them saying, keep going, you can do it. You can make it if you try. You know, singing Disney songs to them about persistence. And they keep on going around in circles, exhausting themselves, and they die in their exhaustion out of the persistence that only one more step and we arrive home. That's a sensorium. And I think it doesn't apply to ants alone. It applies to us. In our solutionisms, in our attempts at fixing the future, in our attempts at regaining mastery, right? The history of civilization is the history of the rehabilitated monster. We're constantly looking for ways to include the outlier, the disgusting, you know, the excluded into our paradigms of thought and familiarity. We think of this politics as good, and I think we need some politics of inclusion. But it risks territorializing where we already know, right? So I think about the monster as the crack that appears in the sensorium. You could think about it this way. Every time we gain a handle on the world's problems, I think that that handle behaves like a door. You know, I don't like doors. Doors and doorways are terrifying to me. Why? Because doors are anticipated structures within the logic of an architectural space. They're already built in. The architect makes space for the doors. And our work is about finding doors as solutions. Doors grant access and exits. They're already anticipated, and that's what's worrisome. But you know what an architect cannot anticipate? A crack. No architect says, I'm going to build a crack in here, you know? Cracks are the excessiveness of a structure, the excessiveness of design. It's how design spills away from itself orgasmically, if you will. And I think that's what the monster is. The monster, since we're doing etymology here, the etymological root of monster is monstrum, to work something, right? So we're living in a neurotypical systemic space that has coached our bodies into going around in circles. We tell ourselves we're doing something fabulous if we're being activists. And me, from the global south, I'm here to tell you, no. All the beautiful taking your trash and putting it in those carefully delineated boxes and sending it away to a green emerald city where it comes back to you as a tote bag, and you can tell yourself, I'm saving the planet. I'm saying to you, my people, that it comes, most of it, as your data would suggest to you, most of it comes to my people. It comes to our lands. It goes to Nigeria. It goes to the Gambia. It goes to Indonesia, right? We are subsidizing the righteousness of a solidarity project that doesn't work. And so we're saying that right now we need the trickster because the hero archetype isn't working. The hero archetype slaying the monster, the monster has its own story. Okay, I think I'll stop there.
I'm smiling internally because a group of us were at dinner last night joking that this weekend would be the start of a cult. And when thinking about what the rules of this cult would be, the very first rule we came up with was that there would be no doors. Just saying. There is so much there. The way you speak about the monstrous, I think, is something that has very deeply resonated with me. I think so much of the last 4 years of my life has been about sitting with the fact that there are people who conceptualize me as a monster and learning to be at peace with that. And I think at the beginning of that journey, there was a lot of resistance. There was a lot of trying to prove that that wasn't the case and fighting for humanity, so to say. But I think at a certain point where actual change began to happen in my own journey was in starting to ask the question, why? Why am I so resistant to the idea of being that monstrous figure? If being monstrous is just not fitting inside someone else's boxes or someone else's framework, then perhaps that's not the worst thing in the world. Something I wanted to touch on as you were talking about the death spiral is you've shared in the past, I hope I don't butcher this, but the question of what if the way we respond to crisis is actually part of the crisis? And I'm wondering if you can speak to that, particularly locating it in the context of environmentalism as well, which is a crisis that is inherently urgent, and at the same time, we know, I think, on some level that responding to it with the same type of thinking or the same way of conceptualizing it is not going to get us anywhere. And so, I'm just curious if that's something that has come up for you.
So I hope you admire my shirt. You do? 100? Well, I didn't wear it to impress you. This is quite ordinary where I come from. It's just in fact, my mother would probably blow her mind just to see me wearing this. She would think it's too ordinary to speak in such an august occasion as this is. Recently, I spoke at a fashion congress, which was strange to me because I'm a nerd, and they invited me to speak about being fashionable. The archetypes did not meet each other, but I had a conversation with them about something that Jake and I have been speaking about, Ghana and sustainability in fashion, right? About the fact that about 15 million pieces of discarded clothes from the global north, is a small cottage industry. I don't want to say it's small. It's an industry of waste colonialism on the continent of Africa, right? These are well-intentioned people here in the West, wanting to practice sustainability. The undershadow, the underbelly of that is that it goes to places like Ghana, and I think the data is 15 million pieces to Ghana alone every week. They call this the dead white man's clothing, something like that. The dead white man's clothing. It's not pejorative. It's actually very magnetizing. It's a selling point. It's a way of saying, this is secondhand, yes, but the white man who wore it is dead. So have a go, right? That's the idea. That's the story. I think about 30% is picked up by people. 70% is illegally discarded, I think, right? And that's troubling because it feeds into this thing I'm exploring in a book I'm writing called An Ocean of Milk. In the ways, I'm talking about the ways that solidarity can be an extension of biopolitical control. I'll say that again. That the ways that we've been taught to be good citizens feeds a web of suffering. Right? So that in a sense, being good isn't quite adequate to the dynamics of this time. What we need is to be sensuous. Because good and bad and the morality that makes that intelligible to our bodies seems to be misbehaving right now. Right? There's this Japanese manga comic book that I bought recently. It's by Junji Ito, and it's called Uzumaki. Has anyone seen it? Nerd stuff. You probably haven't. You're the cool kids in school. You know, you have? Wow. Uzumaki. Uzumaki in Japanese means spiral, and it's a Lovecraftian thing. It's a horror genre here. Uzumaki, this spiral invades a city and it disrupts everything and destroys everything. Bodies start to contort and become spirals. The city becomes a spiral itself. What's interesting to me is that when people come together and say we have to leave this town is haunted by ghostly spirals, they leave on equal ends, on separate ends of the city. Some groups go to the left and some groups go to the right. But somehow they come back and meet each other in the middle because the spiral is at work. It's my way of saying here that the political left and the political right seem to be behaving the same way. That the same kinds of realities and tensions and offerings and generativities and creative imaginations are being sustained by what should come across to us popularly as different ends, separate ends of the political spectrum. Something is wrong with morality. This is what inspires my formulation of the term post-activism, which is, I think, an unfortunate term. Because most people hear it and say, oh, you're trying to say there's a time we'll get after activism. I don't mean post-activism as after activism. I'm not saying activism should be excluded or pushed away. We need activism, right? Anytime I come into the United States, I need a white friend to get through the airport, that kind of thing. So white allies are great. However, even though we need that, we need activism. Activism seems to be a kind of territory of acting and solutionism that sustains colonial projects of noticing the world in particular ways. It's still a form of mastery. I often wonder what is sustained when we talk about sustainability, right? Like, is that code for we want to sustain our mastery, our sense of control? Because that's how it comes across, especially to members of the Global South. And I think increasingly to members of the Global North, that it isn't working. So I think, sister, that we're in a time of the hollowing out of white stability. And by whiteness, as everyone knows that I often take pains to say, I don't mean white people. Whiteness is not white people. Whiteness captured white people as well, right? Whiteness is a racial, socio-economic, theological, spiritual, socio-material, economic, gastronomic paradigm that sustains itself in terms of a neurotypicality of being in the world. By neurotypicality, I'm not talking about brain types either. I'm talking about a systemic tendency to produce good bodies. Like in the plantation, a good body was the one that could pick the cotton. That's a good body, right? You were diseased or there was something wrong with you if you thought or had feelings about fleeing the plantation. And so we have we had psychiatric diagnostic criteria like drapetomania. Anyone heard of drapetomania? Drapetomania is when you have a feeling that you want to escape the plantation, right? There was a disease for the longing for freedom, right? So neurotypicality is how bodies are organized within the city, within modern civilization. It is the ethics of white stability. I'm saying right now that something is invading that stability, a syncopating force. I call it an autistic politics because I'm the father to an autistic boy, right? My son doesn't have a capitalist notion of agency. Sometimes he goes around in circles. One day he just went around in circles just repeatedly, just going around in circles, and I said, Kea, he's 6 years old, why are you going around in a circle? Why don't you just rest? And he looked at me with this smile on his face, as if, nah, you don't know what's happening here. I'm listening to some black hole music that you have no idea about. That's the sense he conveyed to me. And I leaned in closer and I said, do you want to tell me why you're going around in a circle? And he said, because I have to. Because I have to. And most of us are trained to think about ourselves as having agency. That's neurotypicality. I have agency. Nope. Indigenous scholarship, black feminist thought would teach us that we don't have agency. Agency has us. Like, we are caught up in fields that are agentic. But that also reminds us to be humble about what we claim we can fix, right? When we practice activism as this solutionistic drive for certainty and fixity and permanence and confidence, then we perpetuate a colonial morality. So we're being invited to fall on our knees now. And I know you hear it all the time, surrender. Well, I want to lean into that and say that surrender is decoloniality, is noticing that the world has an agency of its own, in a sense, has an intelligence of its own, and we need to do something about meeting it halfway, instead of trying to rein it in and commandeer it to fixed ideas of what the future might look like. So that's what I mean by post-activism. Post-activism is the eruption of ethics in a moral space. Maybe it might help to say a little bit about what I mean by morality and ethics. Morality is not ethics. Ethics is not morality. Ethics is how the world in its erotic, desirous flow becomes itself. Morality is how we organize ethics, right? Morality is the organizing of ethics. Ethics is a river flowing. Morality is an ice cube in that river, right? It's a certain arrangement of ethics. But most times, that arrangement becomes very stultifying and murderous, and we don't know what to do. So the thing to do then is to look for the breaks in the ice cube, is to look for the spaces that are opening up. That's what an autistic politics is. That is what autistic perception is. That is what post-activism is. That is what black feminism is. That is what fugitivity is. That we are so found that we've lost the ability to be lost. And the Yoruba people say, in order to find your way, you must get lost. And that is the vocation, the electrifying vocation of this time. Yeah.
I think a real thread in this conversation is various binaries. We've talked about science versus spirituality. We've talked about humans versus nature to some extent. We've talked about the hero versus the monster. Yeah. And now you've also introduced good versus bad, right? And, you know, for me in my life, I'm thinking of one particular teacher I had who shared with me once that the teaching that changed her life more than anything else was what she called the third option, which was whenever a binary arises for yourself, wherever you find yourself caught in a situation where you are trying to decide between two options. And you'll really notice, like, hopefully after this conversation, you really notice that we do it to ourselves constantly. There is something about that duality. There is something about the number two that haunts us. We are constantly trying to trap ourselves between two options that we perceive to be at opposite ends of some scale. And so she shared with me a practice around always asking yourself, well, what is the third option? And it is something that has truly transformed my life in so many different arenas. I hope it's something that perhaps you'll take with you and try. It's also a wonderful thing when people come to you in your own life and ask for advice, asking them what the third option might be. I swear every time it is always the thing. And I'm curious because I know you also write about the third way and the politics of the third way. If you can speak to this, and we'll see, this might be our last questions so that we can then shift to some audience questions, but it's felt like a good place to land.
The number of the trickster in Yoruba culture is 3. Why 3? 3 is not the... I've been using the idea of the third way to exemplify this other choreography of the trickster. When people hear it, many people come to me and say, third way is like the independents, right? I'm saying, no, it's not like the Democrats. I'm not speaking about some kind of milk toast centrism, some centrism that, syncretizes Democrats and Republicans and then comes to the middle. This is not RFK. This is not some centrist idea, right? With due respect to RFK, this is not some centrist idea. It is not a coagulation of the left and the right. The third way is a queering of the binary, right? So when we think about hesitantly representing this third way, we would probably put 2 lines and a transversal line that cuts the two, right? This is what I think about as the third way. It's the path that is not yet known. It is the non-legible. It is what in Arabic might be called wak, which is a future that is unseeable, untouchable, but is felt at some molecular level as compelling and urgent, right? So this third way that I'm speaking about is not number 3 in terms of, the addition of the previous. It is instead a disruption. So here's a beautiful example. There are conversations today about accelerationism and decelerationism. Accelerationism says we are in capitalism. We understand that. We know that when we use our phones, we are igniting webs of suffering that enlists boys and girls in Congo who go down into cobalt mines to fish out the resources to feed our phones. We know that. So let's cut the head off of capitalism. It's a very Marxist, aesthetic. Let's slit its throat, right? And the way we do that is buy more, right? Let's buy more. Buy. If we buy more, then we can overload the system and then it can crash, right? It makes some sense, doesn't it? And there's the decelerationist who argue, I think we should slow down. Let's do more yoga, right? Let's lie down. Let's just lie down. Let's refuse participation in the city. Maybe in doing so, we can remove ourselves from capitalist projects. The problem with both arguments, the binary here, you might notice, is that speeding up and slowing down on the same train track will still lead us to the same destination, right? It's still the same rail track. It doesn't do anything interesting, right? We're still on the same highway. Transversality is the third way. Is the path of failure, right? And there's something deeply feminist about failure. There's something energizing to me about failure. It's not just mere refusal. It's when bodies refuse to be included in preset paradigms of recognition, right? You're just speaking about being monster a while ago. Most of our, like I said earlier on, most of our politics is around including right? We want to include you in, and we need that. Again, we need that, okay? As opposed to excluding, right? We want to bring you in, give you a seat at the table. The problem is, I don't want a seat at the table. It's just like getting a front row seat on a Titanic, right? Or as I often say, an equal piece of a carcinogenic pie, right? Why will I want equality in a system that is on fire? Why would I want to center my black mother in a modern civilization that is premised on her suffering? I don't want to be centered in white modernity. Yes, I will be eternally suspicious every time I travel through the Bradley Hartford Airport in Connecticut. I will always be suspicious when I go through JFK. I will probably be called aside for secondary screening, not just because of the way I look, but because of my passport, which is one of the lowest ranking passports, right? This is the biopolitics of mobility. Most of us can move around the world without visas. I have to get a visa to get to Ghana or Gambia or some aspects of Africa, some other nations of Africa. So the thing here, my people, is the idea of acceleration versus deceleration isn't interesting or generative. We need the path of failure. We need the path of the transversal. And how do we clue into that? It comes in moments when we don't know what to do. It comes in the form of the outlier that needs to be fit in, right? This is the politics of becoming monster, is what Deleuze, another French philosopher, would call it. Becoming monster, not rehabilitating the monster, but becoming monster. And I'll end with this story of how I noticed this practiced in front of me by my wife, right? I said that my son is autistic. There was once a time when we were in a shopping mall in Chennai, India. My wife is Indian. And my son was having a moment. He was having this huge moment. Notice my language here. We don't call it meltdowns anymore. We don't call it tantrums. Like I said, I'm a recovering psychologist. My wife has slapped that language out of my head. So she says, don't call it a meltdown or a tantrum in this house. And I've obeyed, right? She's the boss. And so we had this moment. My son, I don't know, something about that moment was overwhelming for him, as you can expect. And he fell down to the ground, and I was feeling embarrassed. I'm a black man in India. It's not easy, right? That's another conversation. So I tried to get him on his feet, I tried to pacify him with cookies or screen time or something, anything to get him to get back into the normative fields of neurotypical progression, right? He wasn't budging. He was on the ground. And my wife noticed this was happening. And then she made a line straight to me with my daughter. And she said, "You're not doing this well. Could you just excuse yourself? Just walk away for a moment." And she proceeded to lie down with him on the floor in the middle of a giant shopping mall that had 1 billion people shopping and doing their capitalist work, right? In this foyer, she just spread herself next to him. She didn't say a word. She didn't say it'll be fine. She didn't give him hope. She just accompanied him. She just stayed next to him and just held him in his fury, right? And I just watched them. And something about that spoke to the politics I've been trying to articulate in my black studies and my scholarship for years. Just that simple act of radical accompaniment. In the same way that a certain trickster stole into a ship and accompanied the slaves across the Atlantic, didn't try to fix the crack, didn't try to give them hope, but creolized the future in the mere act of radical hospitality for the monster, for the thing that doesn't fit. Maybe if our politics resembled that act of accompaniment, of staying side by side, the same way Fernand Deligny, French visionary, did not heal the autistic children in 1967, stayed with them in camps, forbade the use of language or speech in the camps and said, we're not going to fix these kids. We're going to accompany them in their non-speechifying ways of being in the world. And they noticed radical things that neurotypicality excludes from mind. That is the gift of the monster. That is the promise of the monstrous. And that is the third way.
Thank you so much, Bayo. I want to take some time and open up questions from the audience. You can just raise a hand. I know everyone's probably just absorbing all of that.
Wow. Thank you so much. That was an experience and just so beautiful. I think you just helped me evolve my activism, and I have a really particular question about how I accompany the monster.
Yes.
And I think if you could ground the conversation a little bit more in the reality of this world that we live in, where we're entering these spaces and we're trying to do work to shift our economy, to shift our energy systems, it would be really helpful to have that step.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It does. I really want to situate this in the beautiful thought streams that I'm indebted to, right? Some of the things I say are alchemized from my vocations and my public intellectualism and my wrestling with other thinkers, right? Through time, I'm nourished by persons like Karen Barad, Isabel Stengers, Vicky Kirby, Chinua Achebe, Wale Soyinka, Fred Moulton, Saidiya Hartman, beautiful thinkers, and I wrestle with them. Achille Mbembe comes to mind in the asking of your question. Now, I'll just quickly say this, that there was a thinker called Michel Foucault, and he had a concept called biopolitics. I may have referenced it briefly in my rapping. And Foucault spoke about the ways that we organize life, which is very intriguing, the ways that life becomes organized so that our bodies are no longer separate from the nation state, right? Biopolitics is when the nation state and its power meets our bodies. It's the way we are marked, how some lives are treated as worthwhile and others are discardable, something like that. It's how life is organized. So this is biopolitics. If you want to get a very grounded sense of biopolitics, think about China's one-child policy, right? I think it ended in the 90s. I can't remember exactly when. But the one-child policy where the state actually dictates how many children you get to have. There's no longer any distinction between the nation state and how we reproduce, how we move, how we eat, all of that. Very interesting thing to say. Now, Achille Mbembe is a Cameroonian brother and philosopher. He comes in and says, it's not enough to speak about how we organize life. We must also speak about how we organize death. How, again, certain bodies need to be killed off in order for the main population to thrive. Right? Tuskegee comes to mind again and again. Does everyone know the story of Tuskegee? We all know the story. I don't need to repeat that. You know the story? It's basically the United States public health system in the 1930s, 1932, saying, hey, we want to test for bad blood. That's what they called it, bad blood. And 40 years afterwards, the New York Times publishes this expose and they found out that there was no such thing as bad blood. And the tests were on 600 or so black men who were actually unwitting subjects in an experiment to see how long-term syphilis, untreated syphilis, might thrive. Right. It ended in 1972. I think they were compensated with $10 million or so. The nerve. Right? So death, how we organize life, is already a part of the conversation of how we organize death, right? Some lives are discardable. Some wars are sexier than others, right? Some wars are like, oh, there's a war here. There's a war every day in Eritrea and in Ethiopia, but it's not sexy. It's not really media friendly. Those people can be at war, but the war between Russia and Ukraine, oh, we should go there. So some lives are worthy and some others are not quite so. This is what Achille Mbembe called a necropolitics, how death is dispersed, right? Now, I entered the fray between these two bald men, because Foucault was bald and Achille was bald. Nerd fact, I have hair. I tease Achille Mbembe about this all the time. I entered the fray and I said, it's not just that. What could be more insidious than saying we will kill you? It's we will heal you. I explain that. Well, the Tuskegee experiment also explains that. But there is a sense in which particular performances of solidarity and goodness and inclusion and help and aid, as well-intentioned as they are, they perpetuate the spread of colonial reach. Where were you when the tsunami hit Asia, India, some other parts of Asia in 2004? Does everyone remember that? 2004. I'm sure we all know where we are. I knew where I was, I knew what I organized, what we organized to help people in Asia. I didn't know that I was eventually going to live in Asia. But people now are complaining and raising their voices that this billion-dollar effort to organize solidarity, this international solidarity effort that came to rescue the poor people in those islands affected by the tsunami, they brought along with it packaged food, McDonald's, certain kinds of banking systems and economic orders. They are mourning the loss of the worlds in the wake of solidarity. This is the story that is often not told when we speak about the victories of activism, right? So there's no such thing, there's no monolithic thing called activism, but it is important to tell these stories as well. And so in direct dance with your question, how do we ground ourselves within this space? I think we ought, or we can start to notice what I call an iatropolitics. An iatro means healing, where the thing to do is to offer you a seat at the table, is to offer you diversity, DEI, right? Even DEI, as useful as a concept as it is, can perpetuate notions of individuality and identity that is amenable to colonial spread, right? I said this before. I don't know if I told you this, Jake, but I opened a conference for, of all persons, Pharrell Williams. I don't know how he heard about me, but he invited me to open up a conference in Virginia. And yeah, I know, mic drop moment. But I opened up the stuff. It was about Black excellence. And I was the keynote. I opened the conference, but just before me, they brought Google on stage to celebrate Google. And Google got up on stage and said, yeah, we have millions of dollars in DEI. And I was like, is anybody here, apart from me, squirming now? But no. It seemed everyone was fine with the fact that Google has a department dedicated to DEI. And so when they invited me up, I knew I was going to spoil shit. I don't think Pharrell, we had an argument afterwards. We had an argument on the table afterwards, a wrestling match afterwards. You know, my family was like, get his autograph. I was like, no way. I'm fighting this brother. Well, I got up on stage and I said, black excellence could still be a form of white capture. And I expected to be pilloried. I expected that people were going to be up in arms because it was a majorly black crowd. And I got up off the stage and people ran out to me and they said, we've been trying to say that shit for a long time. We just didn't find the words. I think people are going through the motions now. It's just that we conform better than we disrupt ourselves. Like Willow was saying a while ago, we fit in and we're going through the motions. But we need the trickster now to remind us that some of the ways that we address the crisis is the crisis gaining intelligence. I don't have a solution for you, sister. I don't know what the future looks like. But I feel that we need a politics of social experimentation. That we need to experiment with failure. We need to experiment with the autistic. We need to stay in fields of celebration of the outlier. We need radical acts of experimentation with the thing that we've learned to be disgusted by. This is the reason why, I'm doing carnivals with my people. Next year, carnivals around the world. The carnival is a black vocation of experimentation and subversion, right? We need that kind of politics. No one knows the way, not even the gods now. But I think if we stay there in that space of the crack and libate the grounds long enough, we will be visited by a new way of being in the world.
Okay, I think we have time for one more, probably. Yes.
What does it look like to summon the trickster spirit in your work and in your engagement with others while still balancing the resources that you need from this system as it exists? How can you survive and summon simultaneously?
Oh, that is a question that comes from someone who I think knows the trickster to some level. At some level, that's a beautiful. There's a saying in Yoruba land: "It should come close, but not too close." Right? We need a trickster for disruption. We need the trickster for interruption, but the trickster is dangerous, right? You know that trope in horror movies where there's a sound in the house and then everyone splits up? Yeah, let's split up, And of course, us in Nigeria, we noticed this and we're like, no, you get out of the house. But of course, the movie would end immediately afterwards. That's why black people don't do well in horror movies. You kill them off quickly so you can get to the splitting up. But the thing here is, you don't split up with issue. You don't approach issue. You don't call issue with with some cavalier attitude. You don't say hello. Issue is the excessiveness, the spillage, the leakage of settlement, right? It's the hidden tensions that undergirds every framework, right? My work is about coming close enough to sensitize bodies to what the world is actually doing, what settlement is doing. And I point to the trickster as you might even say an entrepreneurial opportunity. Not something to gain advantage over, but something that is magnetizing, right? It's just like the eclipse. Did you witness the recent eclipse? There's something magnetized. The eclipse is a monster of some kind. It magnetizes bodies to it, but it says, do not look upon me. If you look upon me, I will enact a tax upon your body. I will steal your sight, right? So approach with a sense of the sacred. That's what my work is about. I don't go about saying I'm a trickster. I don't think anyone can claim to be a trickster. There's no trickster identity. There's no trickster design. There's no trickster motif. Instead, I think we are enlisted. The trickster is a moment, we're enlisted in this time to pay attention to the trickster. Trickster shows up in different ways, in our own failures, In the moments when we look in a mirror and we don't see ourselves anymore, there's someone strange and foreign looking back at us. It's when representation doesn't quite work the way we see it is, or we hope it works, rather. It's when our solutions bend away from the promise of resolution, right? In those moments, the trickster shows up and reminds us that it doesn't come to introduce chaos. It reminds us that we are indebted to chaos, that order is just a province in the differentiating reality of chaos. So, my sister, my work is about sensitizing bodies to the openings within closures. I'll put it that way, to the queer openings within closures. But my work is also about reminding people that a trickster is not to be controlled, and the trickster is not a solution. The trickster is the queering of solutions, and maybe a politics can arise around the trickster's vocation of attending to what the trickster is doing and sitting with that long enough to be changed by it, right? And I think that's all we can do in a world that exceeds us. All we can do is to lean out the window and say, they should have sent a poet.
Okay, Live, we have time for one more. One more? Jake?
Alluding to the Emergence Network and emergence being such a powerful word for the emergence of something from nothing.
Yeah.
What does this approach to the world look like? When does it take hold on the world? You know, so how many people? Is this the right question to ask?
Yeah.
How many people? Is there a threshold?
Yes.
Where transformation happens? Or how does this come into emergence?
I think transformation looks like infection. Like when does infection take hold? When does a pandemic actually start? When did the 2020 COVID pandemic start? Do you know, brother?
December 2019.
I think so. Any other ideas here for $10,000? If you get the answer right, coming from Jake. If anyone, March 2020. Okay, so you say December 2023, 2019, and you say March 2020. Any other answers? Okay, there you go. Any other person? When did the coronavirus pandemic begin? You know, this is the risk of drawing lines. Every time we draw a line, we exclude a possibility. Every time we name a name, we're excluding other voices, other names from mattering. If we say it began in December or in March, that's real. That is a serious thing to say. But every time we put our foot on the ground that way, our feet on the ground that way, we are obscuring the ways that the world behaves as lines, not dots, not singular moments. I think the pandemic started during the transatlantic slave theft, right? I think it started during the Tuskegee experiments. It's implicated in how we think about public health. It's implicated in how we think about bodies. It's a biopolitics, it's a necropolitics. So it exceeds these singular original points and original lines. So the pandemic has lived with us in molecular ways for a long time, just in the same way that 1945, August 6th and 9th, Hiroshima, Nagasaki lives with us right now. Every person in this room, if you're above the age of 15, is infected by radioactive elements from that blast in 1945, right? Some elements exploded, escaped into the atmosphere, into flesh, into water, into plants, into animals, and the radioactivity spread through generations. And so, in a sense, 1945 exists in 2024. It's pulsing at some molecular atomic level in our bodies. So when did the Second World War end then? Right? So this is the risk of drawing lines. So to your question, brother, I think the transformation that we seek is already happening, right? It's not a spectacular moment in time when Obama shows up on screen and declares that we're now in a new age, or whoever, Taylor Swift, anyone that you think is powerful, now that we're now in the Aquarius age or something like that. I think it's a minor gesture. It's always happening. It just happens in small, infinitesimal moments. This is what Deleuze would call the eternal return, right? I think in terms of infections, because I'm trying to sensitize, especially with the Emergence Network, that the change we seek will come upon us in very minor ways, not in terms of declarations of public legislation, nothing like that. It'll come in very sinister, trickstery, fugitive ways. So you know the story about the ant that I told, the death spiral? One way that it leaves the death spiral is by infection. That is, if a fungus called Ophiocodiceps unilateralis infects the ants, and the ant becomes no longer ant, it becomes a zombie ant. Has anyone heard National Geographic people? David Attenborough, you know? I wish I could do the voice, you know, infects the ant, and the ant strays away. What we're seeking for is lines of flights away from convergence and territory. And this will not happen with community or individuals. It will happen in moments where I'm not looking to building community. For instance, carnivals is not about community. Carnival is about a site of possibility. Just the story that something else is possible. We used to have carnivals in times past where everything was topsy-turvy, where we reminded ourselves, don't take being a citizen too seriously. So people will come out dressed as monsters, right? It was just like a jubilee moment. I think we need those moments, not in terms of marking the ground and saying this is where transformation begins, but in terms of practicing a sense of networked co-inquiry and ongoing learning together, an ongoing failing together. That's what we need now, brother. In nodes of inquiry around the planet that disrupts the power of the nation state. We need ways of coming together that feels like building fugitive networks. Fred Moulton talks about an underground commons, fugitive networks of learning and failing together and passing the seeds from the ecotones of failure to each other. That's infection. That's how I see transformation happening. And it's already happening.
I think that is a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much, Bayo, for being here. Thank you, everyone, for your questions and your time.
Thank you.